G'day there, it's Dave here, Dave Mills, with my third Endgame study, and we're going to talk about how to understand the development momentum theory as it applies to the endgame, but also to understand the endgame at the most fundamental level. Now, we discussed how logically it's not so easy to get the king when there's less pieces on the board. The king, that's how the king is able to be a fighting piece and stride boldly out there, like the kings of old in the front of their armies, spurring their pieces on, their pawns on to victory and promotion on the field of battle. And so we spoke how it's not so easy to get the king, and we spoke about how often in in-games the queens are off, so it's not so easy to get the king. We also spoke about how the pieces themselves aren't so easy to tie down, they aren't so easy to get at, and we also spoke about the plan in the about attacking weak pawns or promoting your passed pawns. And so what we're going to talk to you about is we're going to talk about pawn weaknesses, we're talking about weak pawns, we're going to talk about this position here, and we're going to tie it all together. And just generally in the middle game, you want to get into their red zone. The red zone for white is the fifth, and for white is the 5th and 6th ranks. You want to find a weak pawn or a weak square where you can invade into the red zone, okay? And so that way you can get into the end zone, all right, which is the 7th and 8th ranks for white. And that the red zone for black is the 4 and 3 lines or ranks, and obviously to get into the end zone on the 1st or 2nd ranks. So looking at this position here, black has the open c-file. That's tremendous, that's very, very good, but it's sucking on quite a bit of vacuum there. And what I mean is that it's not hitting anything. Both entry squares to the end zone are controlled by the knight and by the rook. Its ability to advance is and you can't even go to the 4th rank either. The pawn defends that. And looking at the pawn structure, so we know it's about attacking your opponent's weak pawns, and we know it's about promoting your passed pawns. But first and foremost, we want to look at black's weak pawns here. What are the weak pawns? Well, the weak pawns are that obviously the black has 3 pawn islands, separate pawns separated by a file, and white only has 2. Secondly, so white actually has the pawn majority on the outside, which is a very good advantage because it's so much further for the king to reach. And also you have the isolated pawn. So now we need to talk to you about the endgame. Now, in the sense of the endgame, in the middle game particularly, you focus on the red zone, like weaknesses of pawns and squares on, in this case for white, the 5th and 6th ranks. Basically, in the endgame, it's all 4 of their ranks, from the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, that you want to be able to find weaknesses that you can attack in their half of the board. We're talking about specifically weak pawns or squares. So, but particularly pawns, as we've discussed, pawns are the heart of the endgame, just like putting is to golf. So even a pawn like that B pawn could be a target. For white, the A pawn is a target, it's loose. And but what we actually see here is black has an isolated pawn in the center of the board. And right now, both have a bit of torque on it. Both have a couple of linear forces. So the resultant forces, it's at the moment they're cancelling each other out. So the next move should be very apparent, very obvious. What move creates the most momentum against a rigid point of application? a fixed point, you know, like a pawn, for instance. So I'll give you a moment to think about it. And now, so let's just talk, while you think about it, I'm going to talk to you about types of weak pawns. A backward pawn can't be advanced safely because pawns on either side either don't exist or they've advanced past it. And so potentially like backward pawns are great, you know, they're immobilized, they're fixed, you fix the weakness, and then you start bombarding it. Isolated pawns are weak because they can't be defended by other pawns, and also advanced pawns are weak. Advanced pawns are good for the attacker, bad for the defender. Advanced, as Capablanca's taught us, advanced pawns are a weakness for the defender. If you can provoke the defender to advance, that's really, really, really good. And so obviously you can have isolated backward pawns. Obviously, they're not protected by other pawns, which is really terrible. Obviously, advanced pawns are pawns that have already moved at least 2 squares, and you know, it's very, very good to know that who's attacking and who's defending. In this position, the black's 2 pieces are defending, whereas white's 2 pieces are attacking. Do you see how that's the difference there? So the next move, and what move increases the momentum of your pieces the most? Okay, so for white. Now, in this position here, the king, one of the white's weaknesses has to be aware of is the king is entombed by his own pawns. And so in the endgame, you often want to have a structure where the king can advance down the board, has a bit of lift and a bit of safety. But in this position, it's about creating the most momentum possible. And looking at this position here, these isolated pawns are very weak. So rook on f to d1, it just speaks for itself. Also, another point is that now you look at that, the rooks are worth 5 each, and now they're valued, is their combined. Obviously, their combined values, so that'd be 10, focused on that 1 square. So that's a lot of momentum you've now built up on that fixed weakness. And that advanced pawn is a significant weakness. So in this position here, black, is a Grandmaster, Del Rio, and playing another Malakov. And at the end of the day, the move rook to a8 was black's idea of playing counterplay against the pressure in the center. But all white has to do is the rook on the first rank. Now that black's given up that c file, there's less pressure on the. There's no threat of mate, so rook on the first rank to the second rank, lifting that rook defends the pawn, and it keeps the pressure on that pesky d pawn. So after you do that, what's going to happen now is white understands that if exchanges happen on that center pawn, that a pawn is going to fall, which is very nasty. So black just calmly plays king to f8, bringing the king to the center of the board. That's never a bad idea in the end game. So what would you play for white? You've got all this, but you've got 3 pieces attacking, you've got 2 defending, with the third providing counterplay against the a pawn. So what can you do because obviously the rook on d2 that lifted from d1, it actually is now sort of burdened. It is got attachment to that a2 pawn. So what can you do for white? For one, fixes the back rank weakness, the threat of mate in the back rank. And what can you do that addresses that, but also attacks one of the defenders? Okay, there's 2 ideas here. One is a4. a4 can be appealing till you realize you've just lost the b point. you think, yeah, I'll block the attack on the A pawn, but obviously the A pawn provides a very important defensive cover for the B pawn. So you can't just advance that A pawn. Okay, so that doesn't look very good at all, and so that looks like a bit of a blunder, actually, a bit of a significant blunder. Now, so how else? What other defender can you attack? Well, the answer is the knight. So obviously, advanced pawns are good for the attacker. They're bad for the defender. If you're a defender, you don't want to advance your pawns. You want to centralize. You want to build as much momentum as possible against pawns and against weak squares. So in their territory. So, and you want to promote. So you want to attack their weak pawns and promote your pawns. And if you're tied down defending these weak pawns, it's not a good thing. So, so of course, white plays g4, an excellent move, and threatening just g5. Okay, and you might think to yourself, well, okay, I play g4, black plays g5, but that actual advanced pawn at g5, it weakens f5, and more specifically, that advanced pawn is not a good thing. Alright, that advanced pawn is, at this stage loose, and its advanced pawns don't favor the defender, only the attacker. They're bad. They're bad for the defender. So, so g4, g5 is threatened, and white's position is very, very active, and is focused on fixed weaknesses, while black's is the opposite. And so you're actually looking at this example here, and what would you think is in the future for white? In the future for white, is that you can actually put the knight on an outpost. An outpost is in their territory that can't be attacked by a pawn and is protected by a pawn. So you have an outpost square. Also, you have ideas like f4, and you have ideas like h4. So the position for white is moving just in a lot of direction. Now, rook a5 was actually played instead of g5, and in this position here, it's very interesting. All right. You don't want to rush straight into playing g5 because, the knight does have entry squares. So by playing after g4, after rook a5, by playing f3, what you do now is you have the real threat of g5, and you've denied the entry squares. Remember that type 2, if you decelerate, that's a type of their pieces. It's like accelerating your pieces. So now after f3, you're threatening g5. You have f5, and you have the pawn being threatened in the center, and it's all very, very tied together with a ribbon. Tie a yellow ribbon round the old oak tree. Anyway, so if you can't attack opponent's pawns immediately, you have to weaken them. You have to fix them. You have to provoke them to move, and that advancing will weaken them. Okay, and so you're trying to provoke g5 here, and if they don't take it, after f3, you're fully prepared to do it yourself. Okay, so obviously at that point that I was talking to you about, after f3, black did play g5, and I would say that after a few more moves, after h6, h4, then black did play g5. I would say the attacker should avoid pawn exchanges. So you want to provoke those advantages So for instance, advanced pawns favor you, they don't favor the opponent. Knowing who the attacker is and who the defender is very important to know. And so exchanges actually favor the defender because you can get rid of their pawns that are serious threats to you. So the attacker avoids exchanges. Obviously, the attacker avoids changes and tries to win pawns for a bargain basement price of 3. Okay, so avoid pawn exchanges. After h6, h4, g5, try and avoid exchanges here. Okay, so every time you exchange a pawn, chances of the draw statistically just go up. So if you have the advantage, you don't want to exchange pawns, you want to keep the pawns, and you just want to be slow and steady, wins the race. So in that situation where h6, h4, g5, you play h5, of course. It fixes the weaknesses. And so you end up a situation where white in this position goes from having the pawns hit f3, g4, and h5. Black has pawns on g5 and h6. If you fix the weaknesses, f5 is looking tremendous, and for your knight, and your position can just grow leaps and bounds. And so there you have it. There you have it. You provoke the defender to advance. Big mistake. And if you actually remember these basic principles, listen to this audio / watch the video, and as many times as possible now, use your visualization, follow what I'm saying, go over the moves that I was saying, and I'm going to just repeat the moves quickly, and let's see how well you're developing your mind speed after going through more videos without moving pieces. Moving pieces around on a video and watching it on YouTube isn't going to make you better at endgames, okay? It doesn't. You're going to get right into the endgame and you're just going to miss the principles, okay? And you're not going to attack an opponent's weaknesses. You're not going to try and fix the weaknesses first and then attack. Blockade, attack, destroy, classic Nimzovich. And you're not going to bring more pieces to attack. You're not going to focus on building as much momentum as possible. Remember, advanced pawns favor the attacker, not the defender. So provoke the advance, and it's very, very. I'm going to go through the moves again. White plays rook on f2, d1. All right. Black counters with rook to a8. Then rook to d on the first rank on the one line to the second rank, defending the pawn. And then what does black do? Black moves the rook to a5, and then g4. All right, g4, attacking that knight, and then that knight. Yeah, so there we have it. And then after g4, king to f8. I may have got the move order wrong here. King f8 and then rook to a5. Anyway, so then see, there you go, mind speed, working your mind. And then obviously f3, preventing entry squares, helps you accelerate your position. h6, h4, g5, h5, and the idea is here now that weaknesses are being fixed. You're getting entry squares into their red zone, their 5th and 6th rank, and you're just doing fantastic. And you're attacking their weak pawns, because remember, the end game is about attacking their weak pawns or promoting your passed pawns. And that means you don't dawdle. You got to push those passed pawns, and so there you go. Now, fixing weaknesses first before you can bring more important pieces to attack. Blockade, attack, destroy. Fix, attack, destroy. Very, very important principles, by the way. And obviously, in this situation that I'm describing, the rook goes to a6, and so it's a very funny situation, and the h6 pawn is now in a lot of trouble. The knight can go to f5, and look, obviously rook c5, and yeah, rook c5, and the knight can lop off the pawn at h6. The knight can go to h5, and obviously it's a discovered attack. All right, the knight can go to f7, rook c1, and so on. King to f2, king f7. You know, and the g pawn takes h, and so on. So and rook h6. So let's see how well you visualize that in your mind. But if you want to master the endgame, you need to be able to look at this position and understand exactly what you have to do. Attack weak pawns, provoke the advancing, forcing the defender to advance their pawns, attacking the defender, obviously, and in the case of fixing weaknesses, you can see the attacker doesn't want to exchange pawns. The defender wants to exchange pawns. So, all right. So even though the line that I was covering from the game is actually a bit of a mistake for white. Even though he won the h pawn, he just on h6 he just rushes. What's actually so much what the best thing to do is to avoid those exchanges of that line. So you don't want to rush. If you rush, you get flushed. Okay, so don't rush. So weaknesses don't just suddenly disappear. You need to be patient. Like when you watch golf and the putter's there and he's breathing and he gets down on the ground and he looks at the ball and he fusses and he takes his time. That's exactly how you want to approach the end game. Weaknesses don't just suddenly magically disappear. Okay, and so anyway. So you don't want to have exchanges. Obviously, you want to put your pieces on the best squares. You want to create the best position with the most tempos that you can gain. Remember that you can, when you exchange a piece that's moved, say, twice for a piece that's moved 3 or 4 times, it's like you're stealing their luggage. Every time a piece moves, it acquires like luggage, like tempos. How many tempos has that piece moved during the game? It's very useful data. So I wish you could just have it like click on a piece and see exactly how many moves it's made and so on. Some metadata of the pieces. But anyway, so obviously now with pawns, we've been focusing on pawns, but you also want to understand that there's also weak squares. Like in this position, f5 became a weak square. All right. Obviously, now weak squares are in the end zone. Okay. They can't be defended by the opponent's pawns. In this case, white's red zone is 5 and 6, so you want weak squares in their red zone to strike at the end zone, strike at weak pawns, and to get pieces into the end zone or pawns. So, what can we say about weak squares? All right, we want weak squares in their half of the board, obviously, and can you actually fix a weak square? Yes, you can. Fixing a weak square is the same as fixing a pawn, preventing their pieces from actually going to that square, or defending that square, or pawns guarding that square. All right, and the plan is the same, okay, as the pawns. So the things that you've learned in this discussion, you're going to be able to apply over and over and over again. So let's all bring it into focus now. The end game is like putting, right? It sorts the men from the boys, the girls from the women. All right, it's significant. Alright, so you're either attacking their weak pawns or you're promoting your pawns. Okay, so what type of weak pawns are there? Isolated pawns, backward pawns, and advanced pawns. If you're the defender, you don't want advanced pawns. Okay, if you're the attacker, you don't want to exchange pawns. Alright, and obviously when you're attacking pawns, you try to weaken them, you try and provoke their advance, you blockade them, you fix them, you blockade them, prevent their ability to move, restrain them, and you don't want to exchange pawns, you want to capture their pawns. Okay, and remember, treat squares like pawns. You want to blockade those squares, control those squares. You want to provoke, prevent your opponent from being able to use those squares, and so on. And also restraining entry squares, that denial of entry strategy. In opening that ends up where the queens can exchange quite early and one of the kings has had to move, this is not necessarily bad for the king that's had to move, but your first step once the queens are off and your king has moved and is close to the center is to set up a denial of entry strategy where you're preventing any of their pieces entering, if possible, your red zone. Okay, and that's done through pawn structure, and so typically that's moving the F and C pawns to deny the knights from entry. It means keeping your bishops centralized but also flexible, like on the 3rd or the 6th ranks, depending on which side you are, and centralizing your king. So keeping your king close to the center, and also it means choosing a side to get more space on. So if you're, if you don't have that, plan of trying to get more space, so denial of entry and then space gaining on one side of the board. Those, those are the things that you want to actually strive for, and because you can get into an endgame quite quickly from that position where you exchange queens quite early. It's not over by any means when the queens come off like that. So there you have it. That's it all in focus. Take care, and go down below, press the doobie-doos, leave me a comment. I really appreciate it. Take care. Bye.